And this is also an important session for us at ODI because we'll use this wealth of information and wisdom to prepare our own thinking and our position paper and recommendation towards the conference next month, or rather in early December. So this is a session where we are particularly keen to also listen to you. This is your last chance to get your opinion in and to make sure that your ideas are captured in the process between now and Nairobi. I am going to try to use the pigeonhole. Julia's convinced me that it is the right thing to do, and it will be make the conversation lively and interesting. So if you have a look at the screen, so get ready with your laptop, iPad and iPhones or anything else from another brand to make sure that you are logged in and you know what to do when the time will come. Of course, I believe, Julia, that you can also start to log your questions, I guess, as you go along. So you might calculate that we might give you the chance to get better votes if your questions is ready by the time I put them up on the screen. So be quick and multitask around that. So the first speaker is Romilly Greenhill from ODI, that I think all of you by now have met and are familiar with. Romilly leads our work at ODI on development finance and development effectiveness. And she will reflect on particularly the key points that emerged, including in the last geek session, the 3 priorities that you've identified and what that means in terms of the way us at ODI are going to take some of that work forward. We're then very lucky to have Ambassador Freul, okay? Yes, who of course works with Minister Plummen and therefore is actually a representative of the EPDC. I need to learn to read this right. GPEDC.
You have to change that. I think that's the first action point for Nairobi.
Yes, exactly. Make a more vowels, less consonants, I would say, if possible. That tends to make life easier. So we're very lucky to have, the insider's perspective of someone who will be at the meeting and is, shepherding the process towards it. We'll then move to Helder da Costa, who is a friend of ODI, and we've worked with Helder for a long time, and Helder is, of course, the General Secretary of the G7+, and he will bring to the table the perspective of fragile states and what, whatever new compact agreement or partnership on development effectiveness needs to do to ensure that it is relevant and can work in conflict-affected contexts. And that's important because reflecting on the 10 years between the Paris Declaration and today, or 11 that they are, I think we could all agree that fragile states are very much more on the agenda and something the development community has to prioritize. And then we'll finish with Susan Osterlund from the European Commission, who will remind us all that there is still an aid agenda here. There are a number of donors that are still grappling with what to do to implement the principle of development effectiveness, and will give us a sense of what DEC will be prioritizing in Nairobi. So that's a rich panel. I'm going to give you 7 minutes each and be very strict because I do want to hear from our audience, and because I bet that the pigeonhole process might take a bit of time to get right, so I want to make sure I've got enough time for the discussion. So without further ado, Romilly.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta. And it's always quite a job at the end of these conferences to try and sort of summarize the key messages. So I'm really going to offer a few reflections of my own for the debate. I mean, I guess the first one is that it's really great to see the level of interest and engagement there has been on this agenda. It's very easy to say, oh, we've been talking about this for years, this is an old agenda, it's well known and so on. But actually, you're all here, you're all still here, most of you are still here, and I think we've had a really interesting and engaging and constructive couple of days. So that, for me, in itself is a message, and I hope for those of you involved in the process, it's also a message going forward that there's a lot of people very interested in this agenda. I think the other thing that maybe surprised me a little bit was the strong message that's come up about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that we actually have a lot of commitments. We know that these are important commitments, that this agenda, it's not about moving on to the new trendy thing, that actually there's some really important things that we need to bear in mind and make sure and push ahead with. So some of the old principles remain. Also, what has struck me is when we're talking about with the Busan principles, I think there's been general agreement across the board that these are still the right principles: ownership, transparency, results, partnerships. they're still the right principles. They're still very important. When we talked about the aid to the private sector yesterday, the highest vote was for saying, well, let's stick to the same principles, but maybe we need some slightly different indicators for the private sector. Similarly, on the Leave No One Behind agenda, the principles are very relevant, but maybe need to be operationalized in different ways. So I think that's something very concrete that we can take forward, and that perhaps we didn't necessarily think was going to be the case when we started the conference yesterday morning. I think there is still this sort of political reality problem. It came up in the session this morning, and it was also a sort of strong undertone to a lot of the discussion yesterday, that we're all very aware that we're in a very changed and, in some cases, very challenging political context, and we're also very aware that the political interest in this agenda has waned. I would like to hear, to the extent possible, from colleagues on this about what we do with it, but I feel like maybe that's the challenge that we haven't quite addressed. I think there's also a question still in my mind around the sort of core purpose of the GPEDC in what we know is a changing world where we now have many more providers of finance and also many more recipients. You know, there's private to private, there's NGO to NGO, there's philanthropy to NGO. There's, you know, we know this very well, and it's not like this is a complete revolution. We've always had the private sector and CSOs and so on, but we all know very well that it is a very changed landscape, and I don't think we've quite bottomed out the role of the GPEDC and the monitoring and the frameworks and so on in that landscape. So a few sort of very concrete suggestions. This came up yesterday and also to a certain extent today, but I think for us to be clearer about how the GPEDC being the how you implement the 2030 agenda, it's a little bit obvious, but I think it's something that we could remember and reflect upon a little bit more. I've talked about it in the context of Leave No One Behind. It's obviously critical. I'm sure Helder will talk about it in the context of peace and state building. Simon Maxwell mentioned the climate agenda yesterday, the sort of broad global public goods agenda as well that came up. So I think being clearer and also building the evidence base a little bit more about how these principles actually contribute to the wider agenda, I think will be absolutely critical. I think there's also some really practical, concrete suggestions that have come out from the conference in the meantime. I think several people have said to me, and the voting also brought it out, that Neil Cole's suggestion from the discussion earlier about thinking about using country systems, it's not an either or, it's not a yes, no, but actually for providers to think about which systems can they use, where can they make progress, breaking it down, making the agenda a little bit more manageable for some providers. I think that's a really concrete way forward. We also had from some of the previous ODI work, there's concrete things around sort of speed of delivery, for example, that could be taken forward. Fanwell Bakosi from Afrodad also scored a lot of votes in terms of providers using country results frameworks. I think it's very hard to disagree with that, and I think that's a really important, very concrete commitment that could be made. And similarly on the Leave No One Behind agenda, without wanting to just push my own agenda, but I did get lots of votes, I think there's some really concrete things around, you know, thinking about which results for which people, who's involved in the process, how transparent, that I think, you know, you don't need to have a big political mindset change to actually achieve things. So there's some really concrete things that we can go forward with into Nairobi. And then the final thing is just really going back to the country level. This is where we started the discussion yesterday, and we started it there for good reason, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think doing a little bit more thought, trying to hear a little bit more from countries about how does this really help them, what does the country-heavy global light, which everyone is talking about, how does that really work, how does the monitoring process feed into that, how does the partnership feed into that, and really what are the priorities? We've tried to hear some of that today, but I think it would be interesting in the run-up to Nairobi and beyond to hear that much more. So those are just a few reflections from me.
Thank you. I'm stopping. I was trying to be a bit mean, but Romilly's been quick and did her remark in 4 minutes and 48 seconds. Okay. Congratulations. So you've got a record to beat. But more seriously, thank you for sort of putting the emphasis on the how, and the fact that putting the how questions on the table, that means actually coming to a discussion agreement about concrete things from monitoring systems to aligning country and donor systems and others. And, you know, to put the Leave No One Behind agenda center stage, which I would say is also something else that is new compared to 10 years ago, and something that the international community is grappling with. So let me move then to Ambassador Frill for his short and important remarks at the end of the conference.
Well, I hope I can be short, because I usually am not that short. Let me first of all thank ODI for organizing this and making the Cape Conference to have the theme development effectiveness. I think that's extremely important. I've been doing this circuit for some months now, and we've had a number of discussions on development effectiveness and on the global partnership. And the observation that you make, Romilly, that this debate is still alive and kicking, I can confirm that, because we've seen that in many, many occasions and many discussions. The thing that struck me here in this discussion is twofold. First of all, when you look at the results of the voting on the different proposals, it's quite evenly distributed. Although your proposal came out as first, I recognize that. Yeah, joined with Neil. But it was, I think, 15 or 16%, and the others got 8 or 9%. But I think that's reflective of the situation within the partnership, that we have a lot of constituents, that we have a lot of stakeholders, and they have varying priorities. And it is quite difficult to reconcile that number of priorities with the resources that we have. So that's a challenge that we face in the partnership, and we're struggling with that, honestly. Second, at the simulation yesterday, for me, it showed that the considerations about development effectiveness are rather low on the priority list. If you look at the discussions on this national infrastructure plan, what were the most important considerations to take into account? There were the political considerations, there were the head number figures on getting the plan financed, to see whether the process was going right or not. And plus, and only at a very late stage, considerations of effectiveness, ownership, transparency were mentioned, and mostly in an opportunistic way, I found. Somebody said, well, you need to listen to us because you agree to ownership. So it's used opportunistically, not in the sense that they were meant. So I thought it was quite revealing, and that is also what the partnership is struggling with. So let me try to outline some of the issues that came at the table here and link them to what I see as the main functions of the global partnership. For me, the partnership has 5 main functions. The one is setting of norms and standards. The second is monitoring whether norms and standards are adhered to. The third is enhancing inclusivity. The fourth is mutual accountability and dialogue. And the fifth is enabling learning. So what are the points that were raised in this conference, and how do they link with these functions? I think, first of all, norm setting and standards. What I heard in the discussions were demands for more specific and more norms. For example, on blended finance, for example, on private sector engagement, for example, on transparency. So specific and more norms. But if I look at what's happening within the global partnership, there is less appetite to set those norms and standards. So that's a challenge that I want to outline. And that challenge is there because, as somebody mentioned, there is a move away from a sort of an obligatory or a compulsory framework to more voluntary commitments. And setting of norms and standards does not sit very well with voluntary commitments. So there's an issue there in the setup of the global partnership. The question I would ask is, if the global partnership does not set the norms, who will? There is not another body that is going to set the norms. So should we strengthen the norm-setting role of the global partnership, then we have a challenge to achieve that. But I don't see directly an alternative. I don't see the UN Development Cooperation Forum doing this. Second, monitoring. We've little discussed this. I think that some presentation was made in the opening panel by Brenda, but it was very quick, and there was not a lot of discussion on that. But I think that is a main topic for discussion. That's a main topic for discussion, not only within the global partnership, but also at country level. So one of the innovations that we have with the monitoring report that we have produced from this round is that we are going to produce country profiles, which enable a debate at country level, the country heavy, globally light, a debate at country level or where we are with development effectiveness at the country level. So I think that's an innovation, and I think that the global partnership should play an important role in promoting that debate at country level. The third is enhancing inclusivity. There was a bit of debate whether inclusivity is now on the altar, and that has been the altar on which we sacrificed accountability. I think Tony made that remark. I think if we look at the global level on inclusivity within the global partnership, we have made progress in terms of including civil society into the fold, but we still have challenges in getting private sector, philanthropy, local governments, parliaments, trade unions into the fold. And I think at the country level, we equally face challenges with regard to enhancing inclusivity. So there's a challenge there for the global partnership to work on that. Mutual accountability and dialogue, I think that already was mentioned, that we have a challenge there in trying to get progress there. But maybe as a reflection, one of the debates we had this morning was about multilateral allocations by bilateral donors. And one of the observations there was that evidence does not really play a role in making decisions. So is evidence playing a role in decisions by donors and other stakeholders in the global partnership? And is that not undermining the mutual accountability? It's not only on development, but I think it's also when you talk about the Brexit, or when you talk about the American presidential campaign, evidence does not seem to play a role in decision making. Finally, enabling learning. I think that is there where we need to make the most progress within the global partnership. We have it in our mandate to enhance mutual exchange of experiences, to enhance mutual learning, and I think that is also a way of, let's say, supplementing and supporting norm setting and standard setting by enhancing the learning function. And I think that there we need to invest as a global partnership to make that function happen. Final remark is about the political versus the technical. My prediction is that if we do business as usual, then the partnership will go more and more in the direction of a technical and technocratic and a professional debate, and not a political debate. So what is needed to bring back the debate at the political level? For me, that would be the role of ODA in implementing the SDGs. Because ODA is under threat. I think that somebody said there is the Daily Mail syndrome here in the UK, but there in other countries as well, the ODA and the aid industry, between brackets, is under threat. So what is the role of ODA in the SDG agenda? We cannot rely on private flows alone. We cannot rely on domestic resources alone. ODA has a role to play, and by redefining the role of ODA and getting a consensus on that, we can use the SDG agenda to talk about aid and aid effectiveness.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. And both on the 5 priorities for the partnership and on this last point about politics versus technocratic systems, I think Helder can really help us to bring it back to realities in a number of countries, and specifically in countries that are affected by conflict and fragile.
Thank you, Martha. Colleagues, development practitioners. In this short intervention that I'm about to make, basically just to answer what Martha posed to me, how does GPEDC better address fragile states' needs? And also, what would G7 Plus like to see achieved in Nairobi and beyond? When I look back since 2011, as Tony mentioned, in this room we have 3 surviving Sherpas from the old post-Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And the 3 of us are still in this room, and we still talk about this country system, ownership, all those principles. My worry is this, and let me just frank and candid share this with you. How much longer do we need to talk this at the global level, those principles? I remember in Busan we talk about, like Ambassador and Marta alluded early on to, talk about global light and country-heavy approach. And I would expect that by now we should have more talk about featuring more examples and evidence at the country level.
Sorry, I was frankly too strict.
But
My timing.
am I?
Sorry. Yeah, carry on. It wasn't
Let me just share with you my personal reflection over the past 2 days. I learned a lot coming from a fragile state perspective and coming to a very developed country setting. I enjoyed very much the interaction, the enthusiasm, and the wisdom displayed by all of us here in this room. And in particular, I like the policy simulation that we had yesterday. The only downside, though, that the conclusion was inconclusive, and I was expecting something more, but in the end, it was unclear to me what we would expect. But having said this, in terms of our expectation for Nairobi and beyond, we, the G7 Plus constituency, would like to see actions happen at the country level under this notion of global light and country focus. Ambassador Kamau of Kenya, the chair of PBC, and I, we discussed this, and we ran a side event in New York last month, looking at sharing of experiences among fragile states. And in order to honor the Security Council resolution and General Assembly resolution in 2016 on sustaining peace, and this is something that we, the G7 Plus, would like to see reflected in the Nairobi outcome document. I'm also coming to bring you encouraging news. Last week, I was in Naivasha in Kenya, attended the UNDP Global Workshop on implementing SDG using the New Deal principles. There we talked about challenges, progresses, and so on. And allow me just to highlight some of the important points that Marta asked me to say to highlight the political commitment. From our government's perspective, we will encourage our government to take the lead in showing political commitment and responsibility in implementing the Agenda 2030 in line with our own national development priorities and context. At the same token, our parliamentarians and CSOs also have to ensure that their support is given in order to implement the SDG 2030. But at the same time, we also talk about countries have to prioritize sequencing, synchronize, and time-phase the SDGs according to the National Development Plan and context. At the same time, we also urge our development partners that they should harmonize their support to help the countries achieve the SDGs in the spirit of the New Deal that was proposed by the G7 Plus post-Busan. So ladies and gentlemen, what does it mean? That the development effectiveness is what the whole GPED platform is all about. But there is little reference, unfortunately, to the importance of aid effectiveness in fragile and conflict-affected states, central to the New Deal and the Stockholm Declaration, where the IDPS community comprised of the donors, civil society, platform, and the G7+. There is also little information about tackling the root causes and drivers of fragility and conflict, or about countries in protracted humanitarian crisis. For instance, there was little mention about South-South cooperation. They did mention, but not necessarily on fragile-to-fragile cooperation, which is gaining traction among the G7+ at the country level. This, in our view, is a step backward with respect to the Mexico communique, which made extensive reference to the New Deal, the G7+, the IDPS, and fragility and conflict as required. There needs to be a greater level of commitment affected countries affected by fragility and conflict. Now the question is that how development effectiveness of the GPEDC as a global platform can accommodate and use the Nairobi document as a stepping stone in order to move forward. So for us, the G7+, we are bringing our political masters to Nairobi because we put great emphasis to the Nairobi meeting. Because from Nairobi and beyond, it is a matter of implementing this at the political level, not necessarily at the technical level. So this is, you can count on G7 Plus for us, because there is a strong support from the countries that if we don't do this, then we'll be left behind again for the next 15 years. So Nairobi, of course, we were mindful that Nairobi is not a legal binding document, but at least we can use it as a pressing or as a leverage for all of us in order to put development partners, civil society, and partner countries to be able to hold each other accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Helder. And I think this point about bringing the political masters to Nairobi is important, because it actually gives a sense of how, how to move the political commitment beyond the, the technocratic approach that, as you say, we have a risk of focusing on. Suzanne, will you bring the political masters to Nairobi from the high-ranking officials from DC?
Well, that's still to be seen what's going to happen. It could be that our commissioner might be attending, but nothing has been decided yet. If, like Ambassador, I would also like to thank the ODI and all the participants, because this has been a very eye-opening conference, interesting comments, interesting discussions, and I'm very humbled to be here because I'm quite new to the aid effectiveness, and I've seen the level of expertise and knowledge in the room, and it's very, very interesting. We had an interesting exercise with speed geeking, and I think that's what I will tell you. We did the speed geeking, also our exercise in the Commission with the member states. For the upcoming high-level meeting, there's a discussion paper which has been discussed, and people complain that the donors are not delivering speedy. This was done in a very quick manner. We had a technical seminar last month, and now the member states and EU and the Slovak presidency has sort of decided on the draft, where we recognize the strength of the GPDEC is that it's a multi-stakeholder platform with different kind of stakeholders, which is bringing a possible platform for learning and knowledge exchange. What is at the stake at the GPDEC? Yeah, like you see, nobody in GPDEC. Well, the world has changed. I was just saying that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I started, when I moved to Africa to one of the delegations, we were talking about beneficiary countries. Now we're talking about the partner countries. So I think that's the mindset, and the world has changed. It has also, there's also been a change in the ODA and the share of the ODA in the financing of the developing countries. For the least developed countries, it's still a very important part of the funding, but in the other countries, it's the role of the ODA has reduced a bit. We have other sources of funding coming, private sources. We have also, I think, one of the issues that's been brought up in the Nairobi outcome document is the remittances from the migrants, from the workers outside their countries. So these are the issues we need to look at. So for the corporate principles are common to all partners. The EU recognizes that the approach to achieve our principles may vary. So therefore we are advocating something called differentiated approaches. So what is right for the Commission might not be right for a foundation. They have different approaches. In the document, in our discussion paper, we talk about the democratic country ownership. We've discussed about the use of country systems often. We talk about untying of aid, and we are quite committed to further untying the aid and try to look for the possibilities how to assist the local supply chain, how to assist the local companies. Also to look at the domestic public finance support to that. What is important for the Commission is the joint programming. We have, that's something we will continue to promote and strengthen, but it should be on a voluntary, flexible and inclusive basis, focusing on the country context. This is what we're saying all the time. We should be looking at the country at the time, you cannot have a same measure for every country. We will also continue to promote joint implementation where possible. Transparency. I think that's one of the key words always. So we consider full transparency is crucial to support scrutiny and mutual accountability, not only for the EU taxpayers, but also for the citizens of the benefit of the partner countries. So we are committed to publish the information. I think European Union is publishing now, the European Commission, 90% of our aid is published in the IATI system. What we're looking for is moving from just publishing the information to see how the data can be used. To look into how it can be used for developing countries, for making better planning. What we're looking also into is inclusive development partnership. We will focus on the development of strong partnership with civil society, private sector, and how to empower the local authorities, because to achieve the SDGs, we need to bring the local authorities up to game. Leave no one behind, that's also been discussed, and just to mention, because Mexico had put it up as a fifth principle for the GPDEC, the European Union and the member states, we support it as a cross-cutting issue, and I think that is what Romilly was proposing in her proposal for the Nairobi. So I think that's pretty much what we have to say, except I think there's one challenge for the GPEDC, and I think it's been mentioned, South-South cooperation. We should, if the process is inclusive, we should also see how the Southern partners can be brought into the process.
Okay. Thank you, Suzanne. As you were finishing your remark, I started to look at the questions that I've got here in front of me with the pigeonhole system, and I'm about to overrule the way this is meant to work. And I actually want to start with a question that only has 3 votes at the minute, but I think is a useful one to get us going. Before we go into more discussion, can I have literally 30 seconds from each of you about what would success look like in 10 years' time? Give me one example of one indicator of success you can think about if this process is to work. 1, 2, 3, 4. You all have time to think, Romilly.
This is mean. I think the GPEDC becomes the place that we think about how we work together to implement the SDG, the Agenda 2030. So if we have, I think the norm setting, the monitoring, the principles, this is around partnership, this is how we actually do this properly, and if we both focus on the kind of critical elements of the 2030 agenda and also the widening the partnership to include the wider group of actors, I think that's where this is where we will add value.
Okay, Ambassador?
Me, if the GPEDC, not in 10 years, but perhaps in 3 years' time, would be the place to go to learn how to do development, that would be success.
So learning. Okay.
Yes, to me, GPEDC acts as a platform in 5 or 10 years' time, but my worry is that it becomes redundant with other political grouping or other platform out there, and you need to go out and do a little bit more campaign proactively. In order to, sorry.
Fine, Suzanne.
I think we need to move from focusing on the aid effectiveness to the development effectiveness, because there's so many other partners in crime nowadays.
Okay, interesting. 4 quite different views, other than maybe Romilly and Helder are similar, but others quite quite different. So let's move on to how the system is meant to work, Julia, don't worry. So clearly the most voted question is the one that is actually balanced in terms of some of the pessimism or optimism that is detected in some of the other questions. So the question is asking, okay, we're making some progress on blended finance, on using monitoring, on framework, on results framework and monitoring systems, but how do we make sure the agenda is truly aspirational? And this goes hand in hand with the two other questions that ask, will GPEDC really achieve anything? So maximum skepticism about it, all the way to how do we make sure that it is as ambitious as it needs to be. So where do you stand on getting right the balance between getting things done and having things in place, but also being ambitious about what is perhaps the political agenda? Let me start with Helder on that one. So having monitoring from blended finance results framework in place, but is that good enough? Is this aspirational enough?
Yes. We need to do more. That's the short answer. By bringing other players, especially the private sector, and all other non-traditional donors to the table, and also other emerging economies. With the likes of BRICS. I'm not sure whether GPDC is able to bring Brazil and others. I'm sorry, but I'm a little bit out of touch. And also the Arab world. Those are the key players that we need to, if we want to enlarge the tent under the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Otherwise, as I said, my worry is that I'm a bit pessimistic, but I'm trying to be optimistic as well at the same time. Knowing that they have this institutional memory with the GPDC over the past few years, I do believe that the blended finance and also looking at things, you have to create enabling environment at the country level in order to attract private sector development. That's the way to go, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Romilly, where do you stand on level of ambition and level of realism and what can be achieved?
I mean, I touched a little bit on this in my remarks, but I do think it comes again to the country level. So, maybe we have some country people here, we tried to have more. It's always a challenge with visas and so on to get the country perspective in. But I remember in about the year 2000, going on retreat in a lovely place called Jinja in Uganda and saying, let's agree between, I was on the government side at that stage, and the donors, let's agree some partnership principles. And that was very much the local process. It was about the local dialogue between the government and the donor, as it was a traditional donor community at that stage. And those, it sort of grew and eventually it linked into the Rome and Paris and so on agendas. But I think, again, going back to the country level, if we had a strong voice in Nairobi from the country saying this is what we really need and this is what we want this global process to do for us, and this is how the learning will help, this is how the monitoring will help. If I can see that X provider is using more country systems in another country and not in my country, can I have a dialogue with them about why that's happening? What do I need to do to move forward? I think that would be really the helpful thing, to have it localized and linked into the kind of wider SDG financing discussion at country level. Okay,
let's move on to a different topic, and we'll come back to the level of ambition, I'm sure, as we go along. So that will be the second question on the deck, which is basically saying, are we barking on the wrong tree? So why are we not talking about the global trading system, and can aid really be effective given the systemic inequities in the world? Now okay, big question, I know, but basically saying we're still here trying to get aid right while there is so much else going on. Is this debate an opportunity to make those linkages, or is this going to bring us down to a narrow perspective on aid? And can I ask the person here who is more involved than anyone else in the process itself, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think we need to recognize, first of all, that different stakeholders are at different stages of this debate. If I look at my own ministry, we have integrated the aid and the trade department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that has been the case since about 4 years. So my minister is responsible both for foreign trade, for promoting export, and for promoting aid, promoting development in the Global South. So there is an issue there where you need to merge both agendas. And it can be done in a certain way, also to the benefit of developing countries. And I think this touches on the issue of policy coherence for development. And if I look at the debate within the global partnership, there is not really a big appetite to address these bigger issues of policy coherence for development. And I think this is also linked to the institutional position of development ministries in government organizations. The development ministries are mostly not the strongest, the most powerful. So are they the ones to bring the policy coherence for development debate on the table? I think that the entry point should be the SDG framework, because the SDG framework requires us to be coherent in terms of devising our policies. And what I see happening is that the SDG is under the aegis of another ministry often. It's often a ministry of general affairs, a ministry of the Prime Minister's office or the President's office. So that would be an entry point to take this debate forward.
Can sorry, Julia, I forgot about it earlier. I put the question now on the screen. Can I get a few more opinions from the room about that? I think we heard how, aligning, sometimes even merging, possibly, ministries, controversial in this country in particular. For example, but this idea that if aid has to have any political traction, it needs to get on board fundamentally other policy areas and possibly more relevant and politically salient agendas in different countries. And one option is to bring them under the same roof institutionally, or at least bring the agendas together more forcefully. Can I get opinions from the room about how do we achieve that? There's one question here.